Right now? Yeah. Talking about the land of Israel, I would like to start with a story that Ben Gurion was telling when he went to a Bonds dinner. He was in Canada, and he told them, they asked him, how's life in Israel? So he told them a story. He said, this man had a dream that he passed away, and he went to heaven. They look at this chart, and they realized that he wasn't so righteous, so he can't go to heaven. He wasn't so bad, so he can't go to hell. So they decided to give him a choice. So he said, take me on a tour. They took him on a tour, and he goes into heaven, and he realized a Jewish man with long beards sitting and learning Torah. He said, that's not for me. Take me to hell. Taking him to hell, and he realized that there are good restaurants, good hotels, great vacation resorts. And he said, I think I like this over here. 3 months later, he passed away, and an angel comes in, and he puts an handcuff on him. And he says, come with me. So, and he tells him, he sees this hot pool, and he tells him to jump in there. And he said, what is it going to do to me? He said, it's going to burning you very badly. So he said, I don't understand. I was there only 3 months ago, and everything looks so beautiful. And right now, everything looks so horrific. So they said to him, you see, 3 months ago, you were a tourist. Now you became a citizen. So this is a little bit to describe life in Israel. My name is Yossi, and I am the executive director of Chabad of Alabama. And I would like to welcome you all for this evening. I'm not going to talk about the politics. Dan knows about it much more than I do. I certainly have an opinion, as every Jew does. But I just would like to start with a little bit of an introduction, a Jewish introduction. I would like to talk about Israel from Jewish perspective, the way it's reflected in the Torah. What it is about this land that is creating so much commotion. The first Jew, Abraham, was commanded by God to leave Haran, his homeland, to a unknown destination. When Abraham reached the land of Israel, God asked him to walk through that land, and he promised him that he will give this land to his children. Isaac, the son of Abraham, was commanded by God not to leave the land of Israel. Jacob and his children reluctantly immigrated to Egypt because of a famine. And after 210 years in slavery, the children of Jacob started once again their journey of 40 years back to their homeland. They stayed in Israel for almost 800 years. Then they were exiled to Babylon. After 70 years, they returned back home and stayed there for an addition of 410 years. And then we were exiled by the Romans. And since then, every day, 3 times a day, we're praying, quote, may our eye behold when you return back to Zion, referring to God, with mercy. And every Tisha B'Av, we're sitting on a low stool, reading lamentation, mourning over the exile and the destruction of the temple. Why can't we forget about it? Why can't we get over it? Because Israel is our destiny. The land of Israel is God's land. The place he calls home is Jerusalem. And the people he calls my people are the Jewish people. And God gave us the Torah with the intent that we should observe all the commandments of the Torah, which the majority of the commandments of the Torah are to do with the temple and the land of Israel. The sabbatical year are to be celebrated only in Israel. The Jubilee year has to do with the land of Israel. All the tithes that you're supposed to give, the farmer has to give from his produce to the priest, it's also in Israel. All of them is connected to the land of Israel. The Torah cannot be unless there is an Israel. Because of all of that I've mentioned above, we are confident that because this is the land of Israel, because we are God's people, I know that we're going to be okay. But this evening, I would like to say thank you to all of you, the non-Jewish community, that came to be with us tonight when we tell the story of the state of Israel. We're going to be okay, but certainly it feels a whole lot better to know that people cares. So I would like to say, first of all, I would like to all of us to give a hand to all of our friends that came over here tonight. Thank you so very much. Yeah. And before we're starting the program, I would like to call Oren Azrad, who served in the Israeli army. And also, I might mention that Dan served in the Israeli army when he was a young man, and then he went back to his Givati brigade, right? He returned back to Israel in order to serve once again at a time that he was no longer obligated to serve in the Israeli army. So I would like to call Oren to say the Mishaberach, and right afterwards I would like to ask Dan to come up and to greet us and to tell us the story of this movie. You have it?
Prayer for the soldiers of the IDF. מי שברך אבותינו אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא הגנה לישראל העומדים על משמר ארצנו וערי אלוהינו, מגבול הלבנון ועד מדבר מצרים ומן הים הגדול לבוא הערבה, ביבשה באוויר ובים. ייתן אדוני את אויבינו הקמים עלינו ניגפים לפניהם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ישמור ויציל את חיילינו מכל צרה וצוקה ומכל נגע מחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם. ידבר שונאינו תחתיהם, ויעטרם בכתר ישועה ובעטרת ניצחון. ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כי אדוני אלוהיכם ההולך עמכם להילחם עם אויביכם להושיע אתכם, ונאמר אמן. Hostages. A prayer for the hostages. מי שברך אבותינו אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, יוסף, משה ואהרון, דוד ושלמה, הוא יברך וישמור וינצור את נעדרי צבא הגנה לישראל ואת השבויים בתוך שאר אחינו בית ישראל הנתונים בצרה ובשבייה. בעבור שהקהל מתפלל בעבורם, הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם ויוציאם מחושך וצל מוות ומוסרתיהם ינתק ממצוקותיהם יושיעם, וישיבם מהרה לחיק משפחותיהם. יודו לאדוני חסדו ונפלאותיו לבני אדם, ויקוים בהם מקרא שכתוב, ופדויי אדוני ישובון, ובאו ציון ברינה ובשמחה, ובשמחת עולם עד ראשם, ששון ושמחה ישיגו ונסו יגון ואחווה והנחה, ונאמר אמן.
Thank you. My name is Dan Gordon. On behalf of my wife Leah, myself, I want to thank you all for inviting us to be with you this evening. We're part of the community of Birmingham. We moved here 3.5 years ago and are delighted to be here. Believe the threats of your enemies more than the promises of your friends. Very wise man said that. His name was Elie Wiesel. You might ask, where did he learn that? What college did he go to? What course did he take where he learned that bit of wisdom? Auschwitz. Tough school. Believe the threats of your enemies more than the promises of your friends, because the promises of your friends are shaky at best and hollow at worst. And the threats of your enemies are real as a heart attack. That's a bitter lesson to learn. We keep learning it. We keep forgetting it. And we keep learning it again. On October 7th, some 3,000 ISIS-like Hamas terrorists stormed across Israel's southern border, its internationally recognized border. These were not occupied territories. This was a border recognized by virtually every civilized nation on earth. They began without warning or provocation and shattering the ceasefire which was in existence. So to all those who you hear today saying there must be an immediate ceasefire, there was. The word I heard today was a sustainable ceasefire, and it was. And Hamas broke it. It was not a raid, it was an invasion. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. The terrorists began systematically shooting, torturing, raping, mutilating, burning alive, and beheading 1,200 plus men, women, and children. The majority of them Jews. The majority of them Israelis, but not all of them. People from over 30 different countries were murdered and taken hostage. Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus. Not just for the crime of being Jewish, because many of them weren't, but for the crime of being in the Jewish state and not killing Jews. They murdered children, they murdered the elderly, they murdered the handicapped. Whole families were slaughtered, children in front of their parents, parents in front of their children. And that was just the beginning of the slaughter that went on for the next 2 days. It was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Everyone has heard that. Throughout the world, Kristallnacht is marked as the start of the Holocaust by almost every civilized nation in the world. That's how terrible Kristallnacht was. On Kristallnacht, 91 Jews were murdered. On October 7th, 1,200 plus were murdered. And they were murdered in an attack that incredibly managed to make the Nazis look somehow humane by comparison, because the Nazis, after all, tried to cover up their atrocities. Hamas gleefully posted theirs on Facebook and social media. And to make it worse, on the Facebook and social media of the people that they murdered. And to make it worse, broadcast it while they were murdering them, so their families could watch and not miss any of the fun. To put the enormity of what happened into perspective, Israel lost more people on October 7th than the United States, when you adjust it for population, lost on 9/11 and at Pearl Harbor and on D-Day and at the Battle of the Bulge combined. And yet, within less than 24 hours of that massacre, demonstrations started to happen, not in Tehran, not in Baghdad, but in Rome, in New York, in Toronto, in Los Angeles, in London, not calling for a ceasefire. Not one of those demonstrations at that time called for a ceasefire, because Hamas was winning. Instead, they said, "We are exhilarated to see what's happening." Those were the words of one professor from Cornell. The demonstrations were held in solidarity with the mass murderers, with the terrorists. In the words of the students for Justice in Palestine of Columbia University, the Palestinians, they said that day, tore through the wall that had been suffocating them and launched a counteroffensive against their colonial settler occupier oppressors, close quote. That is how the Students for Justice described mass murder, gang rape, burning and beheading of women, children, and infants. Because I'm a screenwriter, I'm a stickler for language. Since the only people who, quote, tore through the wall were in fact admitted terrorists, these demonstrations were not in solidarity with the innocent Palestinian people. They were in solidarity with Hamas. So who is Hamas? What is Hamas? Well, for some reason, which I really can't understand, we in the West either refuse to listen to Hamas or don't understand what they're saying. And what they say is so clear. Let me quote from the charter, from the covenant of Hamas, from their "We the People," from their Magna Carta, from their raison d'etre, from their foundational document. Judgment day will not come until the Muslims kill the Jews, and the rocks and the stones will cry out, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." Close quote. What about that is difficult to understand? Well, maybe it's just sloganeering. Maybe it's just overblown rhetoric. Could be. Let's listen to the words of one of the key leaders of Hamas, Fathi Hamad. Roll the first clip, please.
نحن خلقنا هنا في غزة لنحطم هذا الكيان، لنحطم ونزيل هذا الكيان بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. إذا متنا متنا وهي موته، بنموتها وإحنا قاعدين بنموت فيكم وبنجز فروسكم إن شاء الله تعالى. خلص يا 7 مليون فلسطيني برا، في عندكم يهود في كل مكان، يجب أن نهجم على كل يهودي متواجد في الكرة الأرضية ذبحا وقتلا. وانت اهل الضفه الغربيه السكاكين تطلع 5 شيكل، رقبه اليهودي حقها قديش عندنا 5 شيكل، بموت ورا قاعد بفجر وبقطع ايش؟ رقاب اليهود ورجليهم ان شاء الله، وحنفسخهم ان شاء الله تعالى تفسيخ.
What about that is difficult to understand? What about that is unclear? Horrifically, what he said is exactly what they did on October 7th, but we hear that Israel's response has been over the top, and we are lectured about the excesses and the great suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And the fact that there's been indiscriminate killing. Too many people have died. Too many people have died. I agree. It's very true. But to all those who would say that and who would talk about the suffering of the Palestinian people, which I have seen firsthand, and my heart goes out to them, all of those people who are either dead today or suffering today were alive and well on October 6th. Every one of them, without exception. The reason they are either dead or suffering today is that on October 7th, Hamas chose to murder, mutilate, burn alive, torture, behead 1,200 men, women, and children, to wound another 5,000 people, to take captive over 240 more people, the youngest of which was a 9-month-old infant, the oldest of which was an almost 90-year-old Holocaust survivor. People from 30 different countries. While Hamas was sharpening the knives, in the words of Fathi Hamas, to kill the Jewish people, they were also doing everything humanly possible, as insane as it sounds, to maximize and ensure the deaths of their own people. It is part of their battle plan. Oh, that can't be right. There's no government that would work to plan the deaths of its own children. I must be nuts. I have to be exaggerating. I'm a Hollywood screenwriter, after all. It has to be fantasy. Listen to the words of the political leader of Hamas, who's not ashamed of what he says. Ismail Haniyeh. Play the second clip, please.
بل إن الدم في غزة إلى جانب المقاومة والقسام سينتصر على هذا المحتل، سينتصر على هذا العدو. كما قلت وفي كل مرة أكرر، إن دماء الأطفال والنساء والشيوخ لا أقول تستصرخكم، بل نحن الذين نحتاج هذه الدماء لكي توقظ فينا روح الثورة، لكي توقظ فينا العناد، لكي توقظ فينا التحدي والسير إلى الأمام.
What about that is unclear? Hamas says it again and again and again to its own people and to the world, and the West does backflips not to listen to them. For Israel, make no mistake that this is an existential war, and that's an overused term, I know, but in this case it's apt. It means that Israel's existence was at stake. And I'll tell you something that I don't believe you'll hear anybody else say. I believe Israel was blessed on October 7th. I believe Israel was saved on October 7th. I believe that we dodged the bullet that would have killed us. Because you have to understand that Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shia militias in Syria, the IRGC in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen are all puppets of Iran, a regional superpower on the verge of nuclear weapons that is so strong that it sells weapons to the Russians, that has a population of 90 million people, and is proudly and insistently and loudly dedicated to the destruction of the Jewish state and the annihilation of all the Jews. And they say it again and again and again and again. And they actually mean it. I remember a diplomat once telling me that back in the days of Jimmy Carter, when the Americans were taken captive from the embassy in Tehran, when the Ayatollah came to power, and Carter sent an emissary to the Ayatollah saying, "What can we do to get our hostages back? We're willing to negotiate with you. What is it that you want? Tell us, and we will find a way to make this work." And the reply he got was, "Bring me the head of the Shah on a platter." And what Jimmy Carter didn't understand was, what he meant was, bring me the head of the Shah on a platter. That's who we're dealing with. I believe that Iran had a spectacularly good idea. I believe that that idea was 9 months to a year at most away from fruition. And that idea called for a simultaneous attack of Hamas from Gaza, doing exactly what they did, of Hezbollah from Lebanon. And let me put a pin in that and pause and say one word about Hezbollah. Hezbollah has 100,000 rockets aimed now, tonight, at this moment, at Israel. That is more rockets and missiles than every European NATO nation combined. When we talk about, oh, the poor Palestinians and the resistance have no other means of fighting against Israel other than to behead people, what else could they have done? You're talking about one of the strongest militaries in the world, with 100,000 battle-hardened, extremely well-trained, highly motivated terrorist soldiers. They are a terrorist army. It's a new advent in human history. They're equipped like an army, armed like an army, trained like an army, have an army's discipline, and yet all of their tactics are terror, meant to instill terror. They don't subscribe to the Geneva Convention. They laugh at the Geneva Convention. So I believe that that Iranian idea was an attack coming from Gaza by Hamas, an attack coming from Hezbollah in Lebanon. When the war started on October 7th, in the period of roughly 45 minutes, Hamas fired between 3,000 and 5,000 rockets at Israel. That was the barrage that allowed the terrorists to come in. It gave them the cover. Hezbollah has the capability of launching 100,000 rockets. Iron Dome takes out 90% of everything that's aimed and going to hit a target in Israel, not an empty field, but a target. 90% means 10% gets through. I'm a screenwriter. I'm not good at math, but I got that one. That means 10,000 rockets hit their targets. What would their targets be? The first targets would have been every airfield, every military airfield's runway in Israel. Take out the runways, the planes cannot take off. Israel's vaunted air superiority vanishes. It is non-existent. You cannot get one plane in the air. Secondary targets, the power grid, communications, the nuclear reactor in Dimona, the oil refineries. At the same time, there would have been Hamas cells coming out of the West Bank, going into East Jerusalem, and heading straight for Tel Aviv. And you have to understand the distances that we're talking about. From Gaza, from northern Gaza to Tel Aviv, is a leisurely 45-minute drive. It's from here to Trussville at rush hour. Put it in terms we can more or less understand. From East Jerusalem to the heart of Tel Aviv, less time if you're doing it on Shabbat at 6:30 in the morning, which is when the attack happened. So now you would have a three-front war. Add to that rockets coming in from Shia militias in Syria, and then long-range rockets coming in from Iran. Within 3 days, not more, Israel would have been on the verge of collapse. And Iran would have finished the job without nuclear weapons. Thank God, Yahya Sinwar jumped the gun. I believe he wanted the honor of being able to say he started the attack that annihilated the Jews. And I believe he operated under a misconception that once starting the attack, then Iran would have no choice but to say to its proxies, forward. What he got wrong was Iran is not his poodle, it's the other way around. And so after the war started, and he called out, as did Ismail Haniyeh, where is Hezbollah? Where are the knives in the West Bank? Where is Iran? The mullahs in Iran said, shwaya, shwaya, slowly, slowly. Let's see what the Jews do first. October 7th represented the greatest failure of the Israeli military and intelligence established since the Yom Kippur War. And I know a little bit about that because I was in that war. It was the military and the intelligence establishment's darkest day. At the same time, it was the citizens of Israel's greatest hour. Ordinary citizens, police officers, paramedics, individual soldiers, husbands protecting wives, parents protecting children, grandparents picking up weapons and saving their own lives and saving their children, security teams from little moshavim who left their community to save their neighbors. And if you don't believe me, that's the story of the security team at Shlomit who went to save complete strangers in Pre-Gan. And they left protecting their community 2 men. And they saved Pre-Gan. The police in Sderot, who were outnumbered and outgunned, and were fighting Hamas terrorists armed with RPGs, AK-47s, hyperbaric bombs, and hand grenades with handguns, with Glocks. It wasn't that the Hamas said, I tell you what, our goal is we go in, we kill 1,200 people, we kidnap 240, we wound 5,000, and we're out of here. We go back to Gaza. No, that was not the plan. The plan was to go on to Tel Aviv. What stopped Gaza wasn't their conscience. It wasn't the United States of America. It was the citizens of Israel who bought with their gallantry enough time for Tzahal, for the IDF, for the Israeli army to recover, regroup, and counterattack. And that's what the mullahs in Iran saw. Let's see what the Jews do. By day 4, they saw what the Jews did. And they said, not so fast. We'll give the green light to Hezbollah to shoot just enough rockets to tie down half the Israeli army in the north. But we're not joining this war. And they said it out loud. Hassan Nasrallah himself said, I want you to know this was a Palestinian initiative. They started it. They're in it. God love them. So on October 7th, we were blessed. But Yahya Sinwar had reason to believe, even if he wasn't joined in battle by Hezbollah or by the Shia militias or by the Houthis or by Iran, that he could still win. And he had every reason to believe it because the plan was a good one. And the plan was create an atrocity so vile, so horrific, so brutal, that Israel has no choice but to go charging into Gaza. And then once they do, what will they find? Every house is booby-trapped. Every neighborhood has rocket launchers. Every school, every mosque, every hospital, every UN headquarters has a shaft leading into a terrorist attack or communication tunnel. Every house has weapons. And what would drive me crazy when I would see the news reports on either CNN or the BBC or the rest of them, they would say, well, Israel found in these houses or in this hospital or in the office next to the director of the hospital, all in all, only a handful of AK-47s and a dozen grenades and a few RPGs. Like that's what everybody has in their home. Like that's what I have in my home. I got a couple RPGs, I have a few AK-47s. I always keep my grenades where my grandson can't get them. Everybody has those. And they would say that really doesn't represent much of a threat. The Israelis really haven't justified their brutality. Or what they don't get, or maybe they do, is that Hamas's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. If in every house there's a terrorist attack communication or attack tunnel, you can infiltrate people who are impervious to Israeli air power because they can't be seen. They pop up in a house, they fire an RPG at a tank or at an armored personnel carrier or at a group of soldiers. They take out 10 here, 20 there. They spray them with AK-47s, they hit them with mitanim, with hyperbaric bombs or grenades, and then they vanish. They're invisible. How? Either they go back into the tunnel or they walk outside unarmed in civilian clothing and say, please don't shoot. I'm a civilian. And then they simply go to the next house in which the same stash of weapons is waiting. And that's how you grind up an army. That's how you destroy a military. Unless you have been there, you cannot understand that Gaza is literally urban planning for terror. There are literally new neighborhoods that were built on top of the tunnels and planned so that they were like an urban community, planned to take advantage of the tunnels. They're so embedded within the civilian population that no matter how careful you are in your response, you are guaranteed to hit innocent civilians. And that is part of their plan. Because they realize if they can show enough dead babies and women weeping over their children, and my heart goes out to them. No one knows better than I what it is to lose a child. I have lost one. So I understand that pain in the marrow of my bones. Demonically, it is Hamas's plan to sacrifice their own children, as many as possible, because they know the West will look at it and say, oh, the killing has to stop. And now we find the insane situation in which the victims of mass murder are now in the prisoner's dock, accused of genocide, accused of the crimes of the people who perpetrated the massacre against us. I was privileged to go into Gaza. I was doing a 4-part documentary for TBN, which is the largest Christian network in the world, and let me just put a pin in that and say to the Christians who are amongst us here, God bless you. The greatest friends that the Jews have are evangelical Christians, and without you, we would be in deep trouble. Deep trouble. Thank God for our Christian brethren, and especially the evangelicals. At any rate, and why did I go to a Christian network? Because I knew CNN wasn't going to give me 4 hours. That was sort of a given. I'm not stupid enough to go to MSNBC. I've been in the business for 57 years. I'm not that dumb. I knew there was one address I could go to. Actually 2, CBN or TBN. And I knew who had deeper pockets. And they didn't just give me 4 hours of programming, they gave me 7. Unprecedented. And the first special will be on tonight at 9 o'clock Central Time, 10 o'clock Eastern. And then in April, the specials will air every week for 3 weeks, and then on May 31st, the documentary will begin. At any rate, so I was in Israel for 6 weeks making this project, and I was privileged to go into Gaza with the Bardalas Battalion of Combat Engineers, which allowed me to see firsthand what Hamas's battle plan was. Roll the clip, please. Good plan. On the day of the attack, on October 7th, a junior high art teacher in Berkeley, California, by the name of Norberg, posted on social media the following, and I'll quote it: "A historic act of resistance happened in Palestine today. More and more Americans are seeing through the colonizers' rhetoric streaming out of Israel and mainstream American news. The truth? Palestinians in Gaza were forced off their land by Israeli settlers in my mother's lifetime, forced into this small 7 by 26 mile land, into refugee camps, walled off, unable to leave, unable to learn a living for their sweet families, allowed so few items through the checkpoints, constantly without electricity, no clean drinking water, and bombed regularly. Today, Palestinians in Gaza breached the wall that surrounds them, returned to their lands, resisting by the only means available to them. Of course, no one wants to see deaths or hostages, but what other options do the Palestinians have?" That is as good a summary of a horrifically large amount of prevailing opinion in the United States and even more in Europe. So I'd like to take each one of those points just for a moment. Bear with me. The first is the notion of settler colonial occupiers. So the first question that I want to ask myself is, who indeed are the indigenous people of that region? So let me just point out one salient fact. There is one country in the entire world, only one, which is in roughly the same boundaries in which it existed 3,000 years ago, speaking the same language that its people spoke 3,000 years ago, practicing the same religion, worshiping the same God, reading the same holy texts, and having the same name. That country is Israel. Not China. No other country can say that. Not Japan, not North Korea or South Korea, which are ancient civilizations. Certainly not Russia. No country in Europe. No country in Asia, North or South America. If you take the time from Joshua ben Nun to the final revolt against the Romans, that is 1,400 years, roughly, of Jewish history in the land of Israel, interrupted only by those times that we were conquered and exiled by the Babylonians. And when we were conquered and exiled by the Babylonians, who tried to break our connection with our homeland, Psalm 137 was written. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept. How will we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget itself. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I do not put Jerusalem above my chief joy. We're the foreign occupiers? The 1,400 years of Jewish history, up until the final revolt against the Roman after the birth of Jesus, is only the first 1,400 years of our history there. Because when the Romans exiled us, they didn't get us all. There has never been a time in the last 2,000 years when there were not Jewish communities in the land of Israel, in Sfat, in Hebron, in Jaffa, in Haifa, and when we weren't barred from it in Jerusalem. The Romans changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. So it wasn't enough to exile us, they had to change everything. And they changed the name of Judea, from which we Jews get our name. We lived in Yehudah. We are Yehudim. Would you like to see the deed to our land? It's our name. They changed the name of our land, Judea, to Syria Palestina. This Palestina was meant to rub salt in the wounds of the Jews because it was named after our ancient foes, the Philistines. That's where the name comes from. It was a Roman creation. And the Philistines, by the way, are from Gaza. And they weren't Arabs. They were Phoenicians. And so for 2,000 years, even though we were exiled, there were always Jewish communities there. And we kept coming back. Well, say our detractors, that's really ancient history. Thank you, Dave Chappelle. I can take you to Tzfat. I can bring you to the Abu Hav synagogue in Tzfat, or the Ari synagogue. That's where Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the Ari, the founder of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, lived. That is where the birthplace of Jewish mysticism is. We Jews, every Shabbat, as part of our liturgy, sing that which was composed. Where? Not in Minsk, not in Bratislava, not in Munich, but in Tzfat, in the land of Israel, 600 years ago, where, by the way, the population of Tzfat alone was 30,000 Jews. Well, say our detractors, and Mr. Norberg, that's still ancient history, 600 years ago. Fair enough. In 1895, the Ottoman Turkish Empire did a census of Jerusalem, the place where we're supposedly foreign occupiers, according to the UN. And the Ottoman census of 1895 listed roughly 8,000 Christians, roughly 8,000 Muslims, and a little bit more than 28,000 Jews. one of whom was my great-grandfather, who was a famous rabbi in Jerusalem at the end of the 19th century, Rabbi Israel ben Shmuel Dov, Zichrono Livracha, who is buried in the portion of the righteous which is less than 50 meters from the tomb of the prophets. Wrap your head around that. My great-grandfather is buried 50 meters from the prophets of Israel who lived almost 3,000 years ago. That is the continuity of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And yes, we were a minority in our own land for 2,000 years. But since when does being a minority rob you of your indigenous status? By that logic, the Native Americans of the United States of America are no longer indigenous because they were long, long, long ago outnumbered by people of European ancestry. So how, you might ask, did this story get turned on its head? And it's a good question. Hamas, the Palestinians, are a people who speak Arabic, a language which comes, as its name implies, from Arabia. They practice a religion called Islam, which comes from Arabia. They revere a prophet called Muhammad, peace be upon him, who comes from Arabia. When they pray, unlike the Jews who pray facing Jerusalem, they face Mecca, a city in Arabia. How, you might ask then, did all these Arabian influences come to a country called Judea, whose indigenous people were Jews? It came, wait for it, through conquest and colonial settler occupation of the Muslims. After we were exiled, the Roman Empire held on to Syria, Palestina, until the Byzantine Empire replaced it. The Byzantines were replaced by the Umayyad Caliphate. That was the Muslim conquest. And this Syria, Palestina was a backwater province until the Ottoman Turks took it over, and they had it for 600 years until they were defeated at the end of World War I. And there were two people who staked their claim to independence at the end of World War I because they had fought alongside the British against the Ottoman Empire. And they had a reason to fight because they were the indigenous people fighting for their independence. And those people were the Arabs and the Jews. The Armenians wanted a piece of it too, but they got totally screwed. Contrary to everything you may have ever heard, and certainly everything Mr. Norberg ever heard, who has no more tie to the land of Israel than he has knowledge of its history. Directly after World War I, the leader of the entire Arab world, the Emir Faisal, the king of Hijaz, signed an agreement with Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the World Zionist Organization. The Arabs had fought against the Ottoman Turks in the Arab Revolt, which was actually led by an Englishman named T.E. Lawrence, or Peter O'Toole if you saw the movie. The Jews fought first in the Zion Mule Corps in Gallipoli, and then in the Jewish Legion, the first Jewish fighting force since Bar Kokhba. They fought, they spoke Hebrew as they fought under the Jewish flag. They fought in the Battle of the Sinai, and they won the decisive Battle of Megiddo, which conquered the Turks in what was their backwater province of Palestine. They were aided by the Neely Intelligence Group, a group of native-born Palestinian Jews led by a charismatic 27-year-old woman named Sarah Aronson, who provided the most valuable intelligence to the British Army. We had a right to stake our claim to independence, and we did. And the Emir Faisal signed an agreement with Dr. Chaim Weizmann, which not only acknowledged the Jews' right to our ancestral homeland in Israel, but called for massive Jewish immigration. because he believed it would benefit the local Arabs who lived there if they lived alongside the Jews. And he was right. Today, Israel's population is made up of 21% Palestinian and Israeli Arabs. Their life expectancy has increased by 27 years since 1948. There are only 21% of the population in Tel Aviv. They are 35% of the doctors. Nationwide, they are 35% of the pharmacists. At the University of Haifa, they are 41% of the student body. At Israel's MIT, the Technion, they are 22% of the student body. They serve in the Supreme Court, in the parliament, in the military, in the national police, in every profession. And they are protected with full rights under the law. Is Israel perfect? Hell no. But let me ask you a question. Which of you have ever heard of an Israeli Arab saying, "I'd like to immigrate to Gaza"? Because Gaza is the de facto state. Understand that it's not just an organization. It has all the characteristics of a nation. It has defined borders, a stable population. This was up until October 7th. A strong central government, a very impressive military. It was elected in democratic elections. And it has an independent foreign policy, unless you think that it doesn't. To this day, Hamas is negotiating with Russia, China, the United States, Egypt, Qatar, and indirectly with Israel. It was a terrorist state. And by the way, there was no wall around it until we left the occupation. In 2005, Israel used the Israeli army to uproot 10,000 people. Oh my God, that's a crime. We pulled people out of their farms, out of their businesses, and out of their homes. We should be sent to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. We forcibly displaced 10,000 people. Oh wait, they were Jews. They were Israelis. We ended the occupation and we used our army to uproot our own people and make them internal refugees. For one reason, to give peace a chance. And as we were leaving Gaza, they started shelling us with rockets. Before Hamas ran Gaza, and those of you who were there, as I was, will remember those days. For the majority of Israel's very cruel occupation, any Palestinian could get on a bus and come to Israel without going through any checkpoint. They'd be waved through. Palestinians were able to work in Israel at wages they would never get in Gaza and build beautiful homes, and they did. Nothing so illustrates the dilemma that Israel faces more than the story of Wafa al-Abbas. While Israel was getting ready to pull out everything from Gaza, Wafa al-Abbas was a 20-year-old Palestinian young woman who had been terribly burned when a cook stove in her family's home in Gaza blew up. She could not get the medical aid that she needed in Gaza. So not only did Israel not wall her off, Mr. Norberg, not only did Israel permit her to come into Israel for treatment she couldn't have gotten in Gaza, they treated her for free for 6 months at Soroka Hospital and saved her life. 6 months in the hospital, a series of operations that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, paid for by the state of Israel. And when she got out of the hospital and went back to Gaza, her father said to her, "You know, with all the scars over your body, you'll never find a husband." And so her father and her mother invited the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, which is another terrorist organization, which is an offshoot of Fatah, who came in to recruit her as a suicide bomber. Her target, to go back to Israel, to the hospital that had saved her life, and blow up the doctors and nurses who had saved her, and the 100 Jewish patients in the burn unit who would have been on the floor. Israeli intelligence had a tip-off that someone was coming through. They stopped her at the border. It's all on videotape, you can see it. to this day. Go to YouTube and say Wafa al-Abbas, you'll find it. And you can see her as she's ordered to take her clothes off because they knew she had the bomb. She's carrying 20 pounds of explosives around her bottom. She starts pulling the detonator, hoping to take at least a couple Jews with her. And the detonator fails, and she pulls it again and again and again, crying like a 2-year-old child because she is not going to get her dream of going to heaven while she kills Jews. When she was caught, she cried crocodile tears. Oh, she said, please don't punish me. Don't send me to prison forever. I didn't kill anybody. Well, because the detonator failed. It wasn't for lack of trying. And her mother said, her mother who put the suicide bomb on her, they used my daughter. She was sick and they used her. And the Israeli court had compassion on her. They sentenced her to only 12 years. And she didn't serve 12 years because she was released in the exchange for Gilad Shalit. And she went back to Gaza. And in Gaza, she gave an interview to Leland Vittert of Fox News. And there she said, I am very proud of what I did, and I cannot wait to taste and smell paradise once again as I use my suicide belt again. And she gave lessons in kindergartens to inspire young girls to follow her path. That is what we face. But the Palestinians in Gaza is terrible. They have no electricity. Do you know why? Israel was supplying electricity, and the deal worked out between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority was the Palestinian Authority was going to pay the bill. The Palestinian Authority decided not to pay the bill. Why? Because they had a disagreement with Hamas. So they said to the Israel Electric Company, of the 45 million we owe you, we'll only pay you 21 million. You can cut the electricity off to Gaza. That's why the electricity in Gaza was spotty, because of a quarrel between Hamas and the Palestine Authority. And the drinking water is terrible in Gaza. And I will tell you it is. You know why? Because when you dig 500 miles of reinforced concrete terrorist attack tunnels, you tend to damage the aquifer. What do you think? That Hamas did an environmental impact story and presented it to the Hamas EPA before they dug tunnels? There is no country on the face of the earth which has more of a moral, legal, historical, and ethical right to exist than the State of Israel. Not one. And Zionism not only is not racism, it is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people and one of the noblest stories in history. It revived a language and a land. And to the Norbergs of this world, and to the Hamasniks of this world, the days when Jews boarded cattle cars are over. Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you.
Incredible. So I just want to say first of all, a big thank you to Dan. And the minute October 7th happened, he called me and said to me, Levi, we need to arrange something. So this is just the beginning of him speaking. And if anyone would like to arrange another place, another location, he's more than happy to share these words of truth to everyone who needs to and would like to hear them. So take it upon yourself to really let's share this message, because it's a message that the world needs to hear. As a Chabad rabbi, I just want to mention for a moment that we're coming up to the holiday of Purim, and the holiday of Purim is a happy one, which we turn things upside down. The day where Haman wanted to curse the Jewish people and wanted to kill everyone, and we saw by the Farbrengens, the gatherings by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, how he said this is a day that we can really rejoice. Not because everywhere else in the world looks beautiful and sounds good, but we have the chance to rejoice to make sure that we change that sad times into good times. So please God, on Sunday, Saturday night, we'll be reading the Megillah, the story of Esther and Mordechai, the victory of the Jewish people. Please God, we'll be able to read our new story of this war
and let's all merit to really, really rejoice, because it's the only way Jewish people know how to win a war is by being happy. If anyone has any questions, I have another microphone in my pocket. If anyone does have any questions, Dan is here to take any questions. Testing, 1, 2, testing.
First of all, that was the most incredible talk I think I've ever heard in my whole 78 years on this planet, but that's another story. They keep talking about 30,000 innocent Palestinians have been killed. How do they define that number? Does that include the soldiers, or does that only include Palestinians?
It's a great question. Let me answer that one. As of today, I believe they're saying that 31,700, I think, or 31,800 people have been killed in Gaza. That may be true. It may not be. It may be inflated. According to Hamas, not one terrorist has ever been killed. So Israel now believes, and it's a pretty accurate count, that somewhere between 13 and 15,000 terrorists have now been killed. So if you say, okay, 31,000 subtract 13 means 18,000 non-combatants were killed. That's a horrible thing. Terrible. Let me give you a couple facts. According to the UN and the Red Cross, two agencies for which I have very little use, but according to the UN and the International Red Cross, 90% of victims in modern warfare are non-combatants. That means there's a 9-to-1 ratio of non-combatants to combatants killed. The United States looked at ISIS, and there is nothing that Hamas did that ISIS didn't do, and there's nothing that ISIS did that Hamas didn't do. The exact same atrocities: beheading, burning alive, mass rapes. They simply did it for a longer period of time because they didn't have a people of Israel to stop them on the third day. But they were the exact same ideology. They were deemed so abominable that the United States spearheaded a coalition of 86 nations to eliminate Hamas. They went into Mosul. It was a 9-month campaign to kill 5,000 ISIS terrorists. Kurdish intelligence estimates that 40,000 innocent people were killed in that battle to kill the 5,000 terrorists. That's an 8-to-1 ratio. Right now in Gaza, the ratio, and I hate to put it in numbers, but those are what you have to look at because that's the facts of it. It's between 1.5 and 1.7 to 1 for non-combatants to combatants killed. It's one of the lowest rates of non-combatants being killed in the history of warfare, of modern warfare. And yet we are in the prisoner dock as guilty of genocide. Anyone else?
Hey, 1 second.
Thank you for your talk. It's been said that there was what happened on October 7th, which was horrible, and then there's also what happened on October 8th, which is in our country when this crazy narrative is taking place. I'm just wondering how you're managing in Hollywood, how you're not enraged all the time, like with the guy at the Academy Awards and people you've worked with who are speaking up or not speaking up or changing the narrative, and how you're managing there.
Hollywood is basically a pimple on the tuchus of life. When, by the third week after the massacre of October 7th, the Writers Guild of America, of which I've been a member for 57 years, failed to say one word to condemn Hamas because they said we could not reach a consensus. They couldn't find a consensus to condemn beheading of infants. I very publicly resigned. I was the only person who resigned from the Writers Guild of America over that. I'm happy to say that right now there's a letter that's been signed by, I think it's now 1,300 Hollywood professionals, refuting Jonathan Glazer's Academy Award acceptance speech where he lays the blame on Israel. Hollywood's chump change.
Oh, sorry, that was loud. Thank you so much. I'm Christian, friends with Ellie and Ophir, if y'all know them. Thank you so much for coming. I'm curious about elections in Gaza. Are they certainly democratic? I think it's just a farce. I think it's just fantasy, but are they actually voting? Do they even have a voice?
So first of all, God bless you. God bless you, your family, your friends, your church. Absent you. And by the way, I want to put a pin in that for a second. And this will probably be news to my Jewish brethren and sisters as well. Zionism, unbeknownst to most people, has never been a solely Jewish enterprise. It has always been a cooperation between Christians and Jews, always. When Theodor Herzl wrote, he was the founder of Zionism, and he wrote an obscure pamphlet that was called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. There was a pastor by the name of William Heckler in Vienna. He was the chaplain of the British Embassy. 4 years before, he told his congregation, he said, "The Lord came to me and said, I must get ready, because in 4 years, the Lord's going to bring about an event that will enable the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel." And his friends said, "You're out of your mind." He said, "I've got to get ready." And they said, "Get ready for what?" He said, "I don't know, but when the Lord says get ready, you get ready." He happened upon this obscure pamphlet that Herzl had written. I think there were only 200 copies printed at his own expense. He read it. He showed up at Herzl's apartment, and he said, "I'm here to help you realize the dream of the Jewish people returning to Zion." And Herzl looked at this man with his long white beard, and Herzl was completely secular. And he said, "Well, I'm glad you're here. It's very nice. Appreciate the offer. But the Jews don't take me seriously, and neither do the Christians. And the only way anyone's going to take me seriously is if I get a meeting with one of the crowned heads of Europe. So, Pastor, unless you can arrange a meeting for me and one of the crowned heads of Europe, I'm going to bid you a good day, sir." And Pastor Heckler said, "Will the Kaiser do?" Because he was the tutor to the Kaiser's nephews and nieces. And he's the person who arranged the meeting between Kaiser Wilhelm and Theodor Herzl that started the entire enterprise. In 1898, the first Zionist conference was held. Herzl recorded, in no more than 50 years, look how God works, in no more than 50 years, the Jewish state will be a reality. 1948. And who was with Herzl all the journey up into his deathbed? The only person who was not a member of Herzl's family who was at his side was Pastor Heckler. The person who, if you recall in the talk I was giving, I talked about the Jewish Legion. The founder of the Jewish Legion was a guy by the name of Jonathan Patterson. He was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He was the first commander of the Jewish Legion. And he said, "I'm leading the first Jewish fighting force since the Maccabees." And he sacrificed his career because of the anti-Semitism in the British Army. He was a great friend of a guy named Ben-Zion Netanyahu. Ben-Zion Netanyahu is the father of Bibi Netanyahu. Ben-Zion Netanyahu named his firstborn son, Yonatan, who was killed in Entebbe after Jonathan Patterson, who was the Christian leader of the Jewish Legion. In 1936, Ord Wingate, who was a member of the Plymouth Brethren, who was a devout Christian, laid the basis for the Israeli army with a group of young soldiers, amongst them a guy by the name of Moshe Dayan. All of the Torat HaLechima, I'm losing my English. Give me a translation, somebody. The whole fighting mentality of the Israeli army was created by a Christian named Ord Wingate. Harry Truman, who was a Baptist, against the advice of his own State Department and the man he'd most admired, who was his Secretary of State, recognized the state of Israel 12 minutes after it was born. And everyone said, you can't do it. And he said, no, I'm going to be Cyrus. I will be who Cyrus was to the Jews, the king of Persia, and make sure that they get to come back to their homeland. So at every step of the way, the Zionist enterprise has always been a joint Christian and Jewish endeavor, and I thank God for my Christian brethren, and I'm so grateful that you're here tonight. And please convey that to your congregation, and I'd love to speak to them anytime they want. Thank you.
Now the question of elections of Hamas.
So the elections. George Bush, the son, baby Bush, had this very naive notion that we should really have elections in Gaza, and that would pave the way for some wonderful democratic future. And so they actually did have elections in Gaza. The thing that happens in totalitarian countries is they have free elections one time. There's one free election, and then the party that takes power stays there. So the Hamas won the parliamentary elections. They didn't win the presidential elections. They won the parliamentary elections, and by all counts, it was a fairly democratic election. Then they staged a coup against their Palestinian brethren from the Palestine Authority, and they lined up people from the Palestine Authority against walls, machine-gunned them with AK-47s, took them to the tops of buildings, blindfolded them, and pushed them off, seized power, and that was the last election there ever was in Gaza. So, yeah.
Great segue to American politics. Chuck Schumer this week made a very disparaging comment about Bibi Netanyahu. Would you like to comment on that?
Look, I'm not a Hasid of Bibi Netanyahu. I'm not for, my opinions about Bibi are my own opinions. I think it was more than unseemly for the leader of one democracy to tell an ally, which is also in a democracy, that they need to depose their legally elected prime minister and hold new elections. I think that was disgraceful. I think it was absolutely disgraceful.
Hi, right here. First of all, thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited to be here to hear a historical background of what's happening in Israel and beyond. And I think that's one thing that most Americans, they don't know history. And because they don't know history, they accept almost anything that they hear. My question is about the United States government and Biden and the upcoming election. And from my perspective, it seems like Biden seems to be teeter-tottering and trying to appease everybody. What are your thoughts about, I think it's obviously it's political, but what are your thoughts about what's happening with our government and the Israeli government?
There's a reason that I began this presentation tonight with something that's not scripted. Like I'll read you the first sentence of my script. On October 7th, some 3,000 ISIS-like Hamas terrorists stormed across Israel's internationally recognized border. That's the first sentence. If you recall, I opened this up by saying, believe the promises, the threats of your enemies more than the promises of your friends. Because the promises of your friends are shaky at best and hollow at worst. They're even more so in an election year. I have nothing but gratitude to President Biden for the stance he took at the beginning of the war and the prompt way in which he ensured that arms shipments and supplies reached Israel. And at the time that had happened, I said to various friends of mine, and once I was in Israel, got into some heated arguments with some cousins of mine. My wife is smiling because she knows what cousin I mean. Not Sarah, not who's my dear sister, over the fact that that stance would not stand the test of time because in a close election, Michigan will be crucial, and the young Gen Z vote will be crucial as well. And I said there's going to come a point in time where Biden is going to either have to say, I don't care if I get elected or not, and stick to his promise, or he's going to have to start appeasing the Arab population in Michigan and the Gen Z wing of his own party, which is now much more than just the Gen Z. You now have 19 senators calling for the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, which is an interest. What Palestinian state are they referring to? Who's in Gaza? You want to recognize Hamas? You want to recognize Islamic Jihad? Which, at any rate. And I believe that that's happened in his politics, and it's unfortunate, but it's a fact.
Hi, good evening. Can you explain once again exactly what deterred the Iranian government and the proxies in Yemen and in Syria and Hezbollah of not opening another front? Was it perhaps an ultimatum by the White House? Was it some kind of a warning by the State of Israel? Was it an incentive by the Gulf Arab states? Exactly what was it that prevented them from opening another front?
I'm going to give you what my view is, what my opinion is, which is not fact, but it's a pretty educated opinion. I got to speak to an awful lot of really smart people in Israel. In the making of this documentary, I know a lot of really smart people in Israel, both in the military and in the intelligence community and in the government. So that's what informs my opinion. I believe that Yahya Sinwar ticked off the Iranians because they had a great plan and he spoiled it. So right off the bat, the Iranians were ticked off at Sinwar for jumping the gun in a plan that probably was 9 months to a year away from fruition. And so I think initially they were ticked off. But then I think it was just what I said. I think the mullahs very wisely said, first let's see what the Jews do. When they saw Israel regroup, and basically Sinwar's plan begin to fail, and when they saw the Israeli army return to itself and become once again the Israeli army, they had a decision to make. And the decision was, our plan was based on the element of surprise. The element of surprise is gone. I will tell you something which is not a military secret, but you may probably not know it. Israel was expecting a war. They thought it would be in the north. Israel had stuck its best troops on the Lebanese border. And that was, they saw Hezbollah there and they thought, Nasrallah's going to do something. They completely misread what was going on. My brigade, Givati, its best units were on the Lebanese border. But thank God they were, because now there's no element of surprise for Hezbollah to come charging across that border. If they want to come charging across that border, they're going to meet Givati. There are worse things in life, or there are a lot pleasanter things in life, may I just tell you, than meeting Givati on a battlefield. And so the element of surprise was gone. They saw Israel returning to itself. I don't believe it had anything to do with any warning the United States gave. I don't think anybody is afraid of the United States. I don't think anybody takes the United States seriously. Certainly the Iranians don't. Certainly the Houthis don't. The Houthis are sinking international ships, and the United States is sitting there with its thumb someplace and not doing anything. So I don't think anyone really takes the United States seriously. they took Israel very seriously after that and said, not so fast.
The attention and the discussion on refugees and civilians in Gaza and the pressure being placed on Israel that it's their responsibility to look out, take care of the civilians. Why is there not more discussion, more pressure being placed on the Muslim countries, on Egypt, on the UN to step in and take care of the civilian refugees from Gaza? Why is the discussion always about Israel and Israel's responsibility?
Good question. I think it's natural because Israel is the military that is operating in Gaza. We're the one force that's there, and so the onus is on us. And here I will say something that's critical of the Israeli government. I think they are missing a tremendous opportunity in not putting forward Israel's vision for a post-Hamas Gaza. I believe that the Gulf states, especially the Emirates, who are, may I just say, the Emirates are a model for tolerance in the Middle East that the world can marvel at. They want to be at peace with Israel. They want to contribute. Egypt would play a role in there because they want a stable Gaza. They don't want the Palestinians. The last thing they want is Palestinians going into Sinai. That's the worst fear that they have. So yeah, could we put together a coalition of Saudis, the Emirates? Qatar is basically Hamas, so forget about Qatar. But the Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, absolutely we could. I think Israel's making a terrible mistake for internal political reasons. And I think that's where politics are playing a terrible role in Israel, because there are parts of the coalition that simply would bolt the government, or at least they're threatening to, if Israel does put in place a post-Hamas concrete plan. And I think that's going to bite Israel on the behind. It's already doing that. And I think there are things that we could be doing very proactively and setting forth our vision for a post-Hamas Gaza. And there are things that we could do. And they're kind of skirting around the edges. The idea of bypassing UNRWA and Hamas and using the clans of God. There are 8 families in Gaza, 8 extended families, tribes or clans. And they're kind of criminal enterprises, but that's good because they're not interested in terrorism. They're interested in the prosperity of their families. And so Israel is starting to say, well, we could start distributing aid through you, but even that step hasn't been taken fully. And we should, and we could say there can be an 8-state solution. There's a very smart guy named Mordechai Kedar who's a professor at Bar Ilan, and he's been proposing for years what he called an 8-state solution, which would be based on the Emirates, where each clan would literally be its own emirate. And they would rule Gaza because they already have legitimacy. People's first loyalty is to their families. And I think it's a very good plan, and I'm sorry that Israel isn't doing more to actively pursue that. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming my wife Leah and myself here this evening so beautifully. And again, if you have an organization or a congregation or a church or a college or a university or just a crowd on a street corner, I'd be happy to go there. Thank you.
אלוהי, נשמה שנתת בי, טהורה היא